Okay, so you want to own a vineyard. Rolling hills, rows of vines stretching toward the horizon, a glass of your own Cabernet on the porch at sunset while someone else does the picking. It's the retirement fantasy of every executive who's ever taken a work trip to Napa and thought, I could do this. Buy some land, plant some vines, wait a few years, sell the wine for more than it costs to make. It sounds like the closest thing modern capitalism has to a vacation that pays you back. Here's the problem. Right now, in the single most famous wine region on earth, growers are ripping their own vines out of the ground on purpose. Not because the land failed, not because the wine was bad, because there is too much of it, and nobody who owns a vineyard can force anyone to buy what they grow. Between October 2024 and August 2025 alone, California growers tore out more than 38,000 acres of wine grapes, roughly 7% of the entire state's vineyard acreage, gone, on purpose, in 12 months. This is the business you're buying into. Let's take it apart the way an operator actually has to see it. Before you plant a single vine, you need land, and vineyard land is priced almost nothing like ordinary farmland. In premier appellations like Napa and Sonoma, an acre of planted, producing vineyard runs anywhere from $80,000 in a lesser-known pocket like Carneros, up past $500,000 an acre in the most sought-after parts of the valley, with the average for prime Napa land now sitting somewhere around $300,000 to $310,000 an acre. That is not a typo, and that is not the price of a farm. That is the price of a status symbol that happens to also be dirt. A modest 20-acre estate in a good but not legendary Napa appellation can run you $5 to $6 million before a single vine goes in the ground. And that land isn't producing anything yet. If you're buying bare, unplanted acreage instead of an existing vineyard, you now have to establish it, and establishment is its own expensive project. Trellising, irrigation systems, the vines themselves, soil preparation, labor to plant every single row by hand. Industry estimates put that at $35,000 to $60,000 per acre just to get vines into the ground, not counting ongoing management. On our 20-acre estate, that's another $700,000 to $1.2 million. And here is the part that separates a vineyard from almost every other business on this channel. Once you plant, you wait. New vines take 3 to 5 years to reach full production. For the first 3 years in a place like Napa County, the vines are legally classified as non-bearing and exempt from property tax specifically because the state acknowledges they're not generating anything yet. You are paying land carrying costs, insurance, farm labor, water, and property tax on the land itself for years, with zero income, before your first sellable harvest. A courier business can be profitable in month 2. A vineyard can lose money for half a decade before it produces a single bottle you can sell. So let's say you've made it through the wait. Vines are mature. Harvest is in. Now, how does a vineyard actually make money? There are two very different businesses hiding inside the word vineyard, and confusing them is where most new owners get hurt. The first is the simple version. You grow grapes and you sell them by the ton to a winery that does the actual winemaking. This is what most vineyard land in California actually does. It's straightforward, it requires no winemaking expertise, and in a good year, it can be lucrative. In 2021, Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon grapes averaged over $8,000 a ton, on a 20-acre vineyard yielding roughly 3 tons an acre. That's 60 tons, and at that price, close to $500,000 in a single harvest, for grapes alone, before a bottle is ever labeled. Now here's the part nobody puts in the brochure. That price is not fixed. It floats entirely on how much wine the world wants to drink that year, and right now, the world wants less of it than growers assumed. Some growers this year sold Chardonnay for as little as $500 a ton, a price that barely covers the cost of picking it. Others couldn't sell their fruit at all. It hung on the vine, unpicked, effectively worthless, because no winery in the state needed it. You did everything right, you grew a beautiful crop, and the harvest was worth less than what it cost you to bring it in. A vineyard is a business where your product can go from $8,000 a ton to functionally zero in the same decade, on the exact same acreage, with the exact same vines, because of a demand shift you have no control over whatsoever. The second version of this business is the one that actually justifies a $300,000 an acre price tag, and it's the one people are usually dreaming about. You don't just grow the grapes, you make the wine, bottle it under your own label, and sell it directly to consumers, through a tasting room, a wine club, and a mailing list. This is where the real money lives, and also where the real costs pile up. In Napa specifically, a standard tasting now averages $81 per person, a reserve tasting $128, and the average bottle sold from the region tops $108, more than double what you'd pay for a bottle from neighboring Sonoma County. Direct-to-consumer sales like this can carry gross margins that bulk grape sales can never touch, because you're not selling a commodity anymore, you're selling an experience with your name on it. But building that experience is its own business, layered entirely on top of the farming. You need a winemaking facility, or you're paying a custom crush facility to make your wine for you. You need barrels, and a single oak barrel runs into the thousands of dollars, with a full barrel room representing millions in capital, sitting quietly in a warehouse, aging inventory that generates zero revenue until it's bottled and sold, sometimes years later. You need a tasting room, staff to run it, a wine club program to manage, a mailing list to build, and a marketing budget to convince people your bottle deserves to sit next to the 1,000 other Napa Cabernets on a shelf. None of that shows up in the price of the land. All of it shows up on the credit card statement. Now let's talk about why this specific moment in the wine business is such a brutal one to be learning these lessons in. American wine consumption is falling, not spiking, not flattening, falling. According to Gallup's own tracking, the share of U.S. adults who drink alcohol at all has dropped to a record low since they started measuring it in 1939, and of the people who do still drink, less than a third say wine is their preferred choice anymore. Layer a health-conscious, moderation-focused younger generation on top of an aging core wine customer base, and you get a slow-motion demand collapse that doesn't care how good your Cabernet tastes. The result is what the industry is now openly calling a structural oversupply. By the middle of 2025, winery inventories nationwide were sitting nearly 30% above what's considered healthy, roughly 84 million excess cases of wine already bottled and looking for a buyer. California's 2025 grape crush came in under 2.5 million tons, the smallest harvest the state has seen in a quarter century. And that's not because growers couldn't grow more. It's because industry analysts were actively telling growers to leave fruit on the vine and to pull tens of thousands of acres of vines out of the ground entirely, just to bring supply back in line with a shrinking pool of demand. Picture that for a second as the business you're buying into, not a downturn where you sell less, a downturn where the accepted solution is to physically destroy your own product. This is exactly the trap that swallowed one of the largest wine companies in America. Vintage Wine Estates was a publicly traded roll-up, a company that spent the pandemic-era boom years buying up more than 30 wine brands and 11 wineries across California, Oregon, and Washington, brands like B.R. Cohn, Girard, and Kunde. It went public through a SPAC in 2021 at over $12 a share. 3 years later, in July of 2024, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, carrying somewhere between $310 and $400 million in debt, against roughly $425 to $478 million in assets, its stock having collapsed to a few cents a share. The company's own CEO put it plainly in his bankruptcy filing. An unanticipated steep decrease in demand, a surplus of supply, and rising costs had overwhelmed a business built on debt during years when everyone assumed the growth would keep going. When the assets finally went to auction, more than 30 brands, 11 wineries, and 9 tasting rooms, the entire portfolio sold for around $140 to $158 million, against a company that had carried close to $400 million in debt just to get there. That's not a company that made bad wine. Reviewers generally liked Vintage's brands. That's a company that borrowed heavily to scale a business right into the teeth of a demand collapse it never priced in, and discovered that in this industry, being big doesn't protect you from a market that simply wants to drink less than it used to. Now here's the twist that makes this business genuinely strange to analyze. The exact same oversupply that bankrupted Vintage Wine Estates is quietly making the largest player in American wine more powerful, not weaker. E&J Gallo, the world's largest family-owned winery, generating over $8 billion in revenue, owns more than 20,000 acres of vineyard outright, and controls grape supply from vine to bottle to national distribution. When grape prices collapse because nobody can sell their fruit, Gallo isn't a desperate seller looking for a buyer. Gallo is the buyer, sitting on enough scale and enough of its own vineyard land that a glut which is bankrupting small, debt-heavy growers is simply an opportunity for Gallo to buy grapes, and sometimes entire distressed vineyard properties, at a fraction of what they'd have cost 2 years earlier. The same oversupply is a 5-alarm fire for a small, leveraged grower and a clearance sale for a company that owns the whole supply chain and never has to sell at a loss because it isn't dependent on any single harvest. That's the real structural lesson sitting underneath this entire industry. A vineyard is not one business, it's two, stacked on top of each other. There's the farming business, brutally exposed to weather, pests, frost, wildfire smoke taint that can ruin an entire vintage overnight, and a grape price that can swing from $8,000 a ton to $500 a ton, depending on a global mood shift you have no say in. And there's the brand business, the tasting room, the mailing list, the $100 bottle, which is genuinely lucrative but takes years and real marketing money to build, and which only works if enough people believe your label is worth a premium over the bottle sitting next to it on the shelf. Let's run the actual numbers, the way an owner has to. Say you've built that 20-acre Napa estate. Land at $300,000 an acre is $6 million. Establishment at $50,000 an acre is another $1 million. A modest winemaking facility, barrel inventory, and tasting room build-out adds roughly $2 to $3 million more. You're all in somewhere around $9 to $10 million before your vines are even mature, and you've likely spent 3 to 5 of those years paying carrying costs with no harvest revenue at all. Here's the optimistic scenario. Your vines mature, you avoid frost and fire, and you sell most of your fruit as your own bottled wine through a functioning tasting room and wine club at something close to the Napa average of over $100 a bottle. 20 acres at 3 tons an acre gives you roughly 60 tons, which converts to somewhere in the range of 3,500 to 4,000 cases of finished wine. Sell that mostly direct to consumer, and you're looking at multiple millions of dollars in annual gross revenue, against real but manageable costs: farm labor, winemaking, bottling, tasting room staff, marketing. In a genuinely good year, in a genuinely strong appellation, this business can be extraordinarily profitable, which is exactly why the land costs what it does. Here's the realistic scenario, the one playing out across California right now. A frost hits in spring and cuts your yield in half, or the yield is fine but the market's oversupplied, and the winery you normally sell bulk fruit to, the one you're relying on because your own tasting room doesn't move enough volume to absorb the whole harvest, simply doesn't have room for you this year. Your grape price, if you can sell it all, comes in closer to the distressed end, a few hundred to a couple $1,000s a ton instead of $8,000. Meanwhile, your fixed costs, the mortgage on that $6 million of land, farm labor, water, insurance, property tax, don't move a single dollar just because the harvest was worth less. You can be running a beautifully maintained 20 acres of vines, doing everything a good grower is supposed to do, and still lose money in a year when the world simply decided to drink less wine. That swing, between the good year and the bad one, isn't a rounding error here. It's the difference between an estate that's worth many multiples of what you paid for it and one that ends up in a bankruptcy auction being sold off in pieces for a third of what it costs to build, the exact fate that met Vintage Wine Estates' entire 30-brand portfolio. And when it comes time to actually value a vineyard, to sell it, to pass it on, to figure out what the whole thing is worth on paper, buyers don't pay for your memories of the harvest. They pay for cash flow, an income approach based on actual production, expenses, and prices received, or a cost approach based on what the vines themselves would cost to replant today. In a glutted market, that valuation compresses fast, because buyers currently price distressed wine properties well below what their own owners think they're worth. A vineyard bought at the peak of a boom, planted with debt, betting on demand that never showed up, can be worth a fraction of its build cost within a few years. A vineyard bought with cash, in a strong appellation, by someone who can survive 3 to 5 non-productive years and a couple of bad harvests without flinching, is one of the most durable, generational assets in American agriculture. So can owning a vineyard make you rich? Sometimes, and when it works beautifully. A slow appreciating piece of land that produces a genuinely premium product decade after decade. But it rarely makes anyone rich quickly, and right now it is actively bankrupting operators who scaled it like an ordinary growth business instead of what it actually is. A multi-year bet on land, weather, and a consumer's changing taste, where the harvest you're most proud of can still be the one nobody wants to buy. The land under your vines will hold its value long after any single vintage is forgotten. The question is whether you can survive enough bad vintages to still be standing when it does.